Going through my late husband's belongings, I found a note. In the basement behind the wardrobe, there is a secret room. Open it on June 4th, 2026. I moved the wardrobe and went down. Inside stood a safe. When I opened it, I couldn't believe my eyes. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. For 23 years I thought I knew my husband. That's the thing about long marriages. They calcify into certainty. You stop asking questions because you believe you already know all the answers. You know how he takes his coffee black. No sugar. You know the way he clears his throat before delivering bad news. You know the exact creak of the third stair when he comes home late. You think that kind of knowledge is the same as intimacy. I know now that it isn't. Thomas Calloway died on a Tuesday in March. A heart attack. The doctor said fast. They assured me as if speed was a kindness. He was 56 years old. Still lean and sharp-eyed. Still capable of filling a doorframe with a presence that made people stop talking. He coached his nephew's Little League team on weekends. He made my mother laugh at Thanksgiving. He drove a sensible Ford and kept his shoes polished and remembered every birthday in the family with a handwritten card. He was by every visible measure a good man. I believed that completely until I started going through his things. The weeks after the funeral are a blur of casseroles and condolence cards, of signing documents I barely read and nodding at things people said to me. Our house in Columbus, the one we'd bought when our daughter Claire was still in diapers, suddenly felt enormous. Every room held an echo. I slept on my side of the bed from habit, leaving his side untouched until the grief counselor gently suggested that wasn't healthy. It was the second week of April when I finally began sorting through Thomas's home office. Claire had offered to help, but I wanted to do it alone. There is a particular kind of intimacy in going through a dead person's belongings. You are archaeologist and mourner at once, and I wasn't ready to share that with anyone. The first strange thing was the second phone. I found it in a shoe box at the back of the closet shelf wrapped in an old gym sock. It was a prepaid phone, a cheap Samsung, the kind teenagers buy when they don't want their parents to know what they're doing. The battery was dead. I stared at it for a long time, turning it over in my hands, telling myself there was a reasonable explanation. Thomas traveled for work. Maybe it was a security precaution. Maybe it was something to do with the business. Thomas had been a partner at a mid-sized commercial real estate investment firm, Callaway Hart Properties. He'd built it over 15 years with his business partner, a woman named Diana Hart. I had met Diana perhaps a dozen times over the years at company events, at the occasional dinner. She was polished, efficient, and had always treated me with a particular brand of cool politeness that I'd interpreted as professional distance. She and Thomas had always insisted the partnership was purely business. I plugged the prepaid phone into a charger and waited. The second strange thing was the night I found the note. I had been working my way methodically through the basement, which Thomas had always called his domain. Tools, old files, Christmas decorations, and labeled plastic bins. He was organized in a way that had always impressed me. Everything in its place. The note was tucked inside an envelope taped to the underside of his workbench drawer. Not hidden exactly. It would have been found eventually by anyone cleaning out the space. It was written in Thomas's handwriting, the blocky engineer's print I'd seen on grocery lists and birthday cards for over 2 decades. In the basement behind the shelf, there was a hidden room. Open it on June 4th, 2026. I sat down on the cold concrete floor and read it 3 more times. June 4th, 2026. That was 14 months away from when he died. He had written this knowing he would be gone, or at least preparing for that possibility. Why that date? Why not leave a lawyer's number, a key, an explanation? Why the theater of a secret room and a specific calendar date? I felt the first cold finger of something that wasn't grief. The shelf he meant was obvious once I looked. A heavy wooden unit bolted to the far basement wall, stacked with paint cans and old tools. I moved toward it and pushed. It shifted just slightly on concealed casters. Behind it was a door, plain and hollow core, with a standard keypad lock, glowing faintly red. I stood there in the dim basement light, the hum of the furnace behind me, the smell of old wood and motor oil around me, and I understood with absolute clarity that I was standing at the edge of something I could not unknow. I went back upstairs. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table where Thomas and I had eaten 10,000 breakfasts, and I waited for my hands to stop shaking. It was only April. The note said June 4th. I had 14 months worth of questions and no idea, yet how dangerous the answers would be. I didn't open the room that night. I'm not sure I could have, even if I'd known the code. There is a particular kind of fear that doesn't announce itself as fear. It arrives dressed as calm, as practicality, as the simple need to sit quietly and think. That's what came over me as I sat at my kitchen table in the weeks following the discovery of the note. Not panic, not tears, just a cold, careful stillness. The way the air feels before a storm that hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. I started making lists. That has always been how I cope. I am a former high school history teacher, and I believe in the discipline of evidence. I got a yellow legal pad, and I wrote down everything that had struck me as odd about the last 2 years of Thomas's life. Things I had noticed but explained away because explaining away is what you do when you trust someone completely. The prepaid phone. I had charged it and found it wiped clean. Factory reset. Not a single contact or message remaining, but the account linked to the carrier, which I found through the SIM card serial number and a very patient call center representative, showed monthly charges going back for years. For years of a phone I never knew existed, the trips. Thomas had traveled frequently for work, quarterly meetings in Chicago, site visits in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, normal enough for a commercial real estate partner. But when I pulled his credit card statements, which I had full access to as his widow, I found hotel charges in cities that didn't match his stated itineraries. Columbus charges on nights he'd claimed to be in Cleveland, a Chicago hotel receipt for 2 people. I recognized the upgrade notation from the line item on a trip, where he told me the meeting was just a half day, the money. This was where my hands truly began to shake. Thomas had always managed our finances. I had been content to let him. I had a teacher's salary. We lived modestly. Everything seemed fine. But when I sat down with our actual accounts for the first time since his death, something felt wrong. We owned our house outright. Yes, we had a retirement account, but Callaway Hart Properties had been profitable for years, and the distributions that should have flowed to Thomas's share seemed smaller than they should have been, far smaller. I am not a forensic accountant, but I understood enough to know that something had been siphoned, structured, or hidden. And then there was Diana Hart. I thought about Diana carefully and methodically, the way I used to think about a historical source, looking for what it said, what it omitted, and who benefited from both. Diana had called me once after the funeral, a brief formal condolence. Her brother, Connor Hart, who was the firm's retained attorney, had handled the estate filing paperwork, and had been helpful and smooth, and had gently steered me away from several questions with the polished efficiency of someone who had been trained to do exactly that. At the time, I had interpreted this as competence. Now, I wondered what it was he had been steering me away from. The fear was real. I want to be honest about that. I was 51 years old, a retired school teacher, alone in a house in Columbus, Ohio. I did not have a law degree. I did not have powerful friends. I did not have a clear picture of what I was dealing with. Only the growing certainty that the man I had mourned was not the man I had thought I was mourning, and that there were people, organized, resourced, legally represented people, who had a strong interest in my staying confused and grief-stricken and out of the way. But I had been a history teacher, and history had taught me one thing above all others. The people who control the narrative control the outcome. I was not going to let Diana Hart control my narrative. I made a decision on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, sitting at my kitchen table with my yellow legal pad and a cold cup of coffee. I was going to find out what was in that room. And before I opened it on June 4th, as the note instructed, I was going to know enough to understand what I was looking at when I found it. My first step was finding a lawyer, who was not Connor Hart. I asked my friend Patricia, who had been through a difficult divorce 3 years earlier, and had come out the other side with her dignity and half her retirement intact, for a recommendation. She gave me a name, Ellen Marsh, a Columbus attorney who specialized in estate disputes and financial fraud, not a household name, but Patricia said she was the kind of lawyer who made opposing counsel nervous. I called Ellen's office the next morning and made an appointment for the following week, telling the receptionist only that I had questions about my late husband's estate. I said nothing about a secret room or a hidden phone or Diana Hart. Not yet. My second step was quieter and more personal. I drove to the library, not the one near our house where people knew me, but the branch on the east side. And I spent an afternoon learning everything publicly available about Callaway Hart Properties, incorporation records, property filings, the firm's registered agent, business licenses. Connor Hart's name was on nearly every document. I drove home through the early evening, the city settling into its afterwork rhythms around me, and I thought about the keypad in the basement glowing its faint red, counting down to June 4th. 14 months had become 11. Whatever Thomas had locked in that room, he had chosen that date deliberately. I needed to be ready. I was going to be ready. Ellen Marsh's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. The kind of office that projects seriousness rather than prestige, which I immediately found reassuring. Ellen herself was in her mid-50s, compact and direct, with a kind of face that didn't perform warmth, but didn't withhold it either. She listened without interrupting while I laid out everything I had. The note, the phone, the hotel receipts, the financial discrepancies, Diana Hart, Connor Hart's convenient involvement in my estate paperwork. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her notes. "You haven't told anyone else about the room?" she asked. "No one," I said. She nodded slowly. "Good. Keep it that way." She explained what she could and couldn't do. She could petition the probate court to compel a full accounting of Callaway Hart's financials, citing the discrepancies I'd found. She could file a request to review all documents Connor Hart had prepared in his dual role as the firm's attorney and as the person who'd process my husband's estate, which was a potential conflict of interest significant enough to get a judge's attention. She could not make anything happen quickly, but she could make things happen in ways that would be very difficult to undo. "The other side will know you've lawyered up within about 48 hours of me filing anything," she said. "Are you prepared for that?" I told her I was. She filed the initial motion on a Thursday in early May. By Saturday morning, I had a voicemail from Connor Hart. His voice was measured, pleasant, the voice of a man who had practiced being non-threatening in situations that were in fact quite threatening. He said he'd heard I had some questions about the estate, and that he'd love to sit down and help clarify anything that was confusing. He said this was completely understandable given how overwhelming grief could be. The word overwhelming snagged at me like a splinter. He wasn't expressing sympathy. He was offering a diagnosis. I didn't call him back. 2 days later, Diana Hart called. I let that go to voicemail too, but I listened to it very carefully. Diana expressed condolences again months after the funeral, and said she wanted to reconnect and take me to lunch. Her voice had a warmth I'd never heard from her in person. And that warmth, precisely because it was new, told me everything. They knew something was moving. They didn't know what or how much I knew. They were probing. I forwarded both voicemails to Ellen. The first concrete proof arrived not from a lawyer or a court filing, but from a woman named Gail Peterson. Gail was a former administrative assistant at Callaway Hart who had left the firm 18 months before Thomas died. A departure I'd heard about vaguely at the time and thought nothing of. I found her because her name appeared repeatedly in the early incorporation documents as the registered notary. And when I searched for her online, I found she had started her own small bookkeeping firm. On impulse, I sent her an email through her business website identifying myself as Thomas Callaway's widow, and saying only that I was reviewing some old firm documents and wondered if she'd be willing to speak with me. She called me back within 2 hours. She had been waiting, she said, for someone to call. We met at a coffee shop in Westerville on a gray Tuesday afternoon in my day. Gail was around 40, nervous in the specific way of someone who had been carrying a weight for a long time, and wasn't sure yet whether setting it down would feel like relief or catastrophe. She told me that for the last 3 years of her employment, she'd been asked by Connor Hart, always by Connor Hart, to notarize documents that she was not allowed to read in full before signing. Documents related to property transfers, asset restructuring, a series of LLCs with names she didn't recognize. She had raised concerns once and been given a raise, and told to stop raising concerns. She had quit shortly after. She had not spoken to anyone about this because she had signed an NDA, and because Connor Hart was the kind of attorney who made sure you remembered that NDAs had teeth. But I kept copies, she said, and slid a manila envelope across the coffee shop table. My hands were steady when I took it. I don't know how. Inside were photocopies, imperfect, some pages slightly tilted, the kind of copies made quickly and carefully, of 18 documents, property transfers, LLC registrations, and one document that made my vision briefly blur. A trust instrument dated 4 years ago, transferring a significant portfolio of Thomas's personal real estate holdings into a trust of which the sole beneficiary was Diana Hart. A trust my husband had signed. A trust one had known nothing about. A trust that had been prepared by Connor Hart and never disclosed during the probate process. I sat in that coffee shop in Westerville, Ohio, with the gray May light coming through the windows, and I understood that this was the point of no return. Not the room in the basement, not the note. This whatever was behind that keypad on June 4th, it existed within this context. My husband had been systematically transferring our shared wealth to his business partner, and his brother-in-law had helped him hide it, and was now helping her keep it. I drove home carefully, both hands on the wheel, doing the exact speed limit the entire way. I called Ellen that evening and told her about Gail and the envelope. There was a pause on the line. "Bring it in tomorrow morning," she said. First thing I said I would. And then I sat in my kitchen in my quiet house and I thought about Thomas, not with grief anymore, with something colder and more clarifying. June 4th arrived on a Thursday. I had not slept well in the days leading up to it. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular restlessness of someone who has been preparing for something for a long time, and can finally feel it approaching. Ellen had the documents from Gail securely copied and filed. She had also retained a forensic accountant named David Park, who had spent 3 weeks with the Callaway Hart financial records we'd obtained through the probate motion, and had produced a preliminary report that was, in his careful, Ellen, not Claire, not Patricia, not anyone. Ellen had led me to wait, to know what I was looking at before I introduced anyone else to it. I went to the basement alone at 9 in the morning. The shelf moved easily on its casters once you knew the trick of it, pushing slightly to the left before pulling forward. The keypad glowed. I had thought a great deal about the code. Thomas was a man of patterns. He liked anniversaries, significant dates. I tried our wedding date first. Nothing. I tried Claire's birthday. Nothing. Then I tried the date Thomas and I had first met, October 11th, 1998, and the lock clicked open. The room was perhaps 10 feet by 12. Thomas had built it himself. If I could tell, the workmanship was careful and personal, like everything he did with his hands. Along one wall were metal shelves holding a row of accordion files, each one labeled in his handwriting. In the center of the room sat a medium-sized floor safe, the kind you bolt to concrete, with a combination dial. Beside the safe, on a small wooden table, was a sealed envelope with my name on it. I sat down on the floor because my legs weren't entirely reliable at that moment, and I opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages long, and I will not reproduce all of it here. What I will say is this. Thomas knew he was sick before he told me. He had been diagnosed with an early cardiac condition 18 months before he died, and the diagnosis had apparently produced in him something I had not known him capable of, a reckoning. The letter was his attempt, inadequate and too late and structured around his own comfort rather than mine, to explain what he had done, and to give me the means to undo it. The safe combination was our daughter's middle name, Rose, translated into its numerical keypad equivalent. Inside the safe were the original signed copies of every fraudulent document Gail had given me photocopies of, plus more. There were also 2 USB drives containing digital records, email correspondence, and most critically, recordings. Thomas had recorded conversations with Diana and Connor over the final 18 months of his life. There was a handwritten ledger detailing 6 years of under-reported partnership distributions and diverted assets. And there was a second envelope containing a document Thomas had drafted by an independent attorney, one I had never met, that detailed his account of the conspiracy, and named both Diana and Connor Hart as co-conspirators in a scheme to defraud his estate. The total value of concealed and diverted assets, as Thomas himself estimated it in the ledger, was approximately $2.3 million. I photographed everything with my phone before I touched anything. Then I called Ellen. She arrived within the hour with a notary and a document box. We worked and said little. She was professional in the way of someone who had seen versions of this before, but was still capable of being affected by it. At one point, she picked up the ledger, looked at a page, and set it down with a particular quietness that told me she was carefully managing her expression. What I had not anticipated was that someone had been watching the house. I know this now from the timeline. Connor Hart had retained a private investigator. This came out later, who had noted the arrival of Ellen's car and photographed it. By early afternoon, Connor had called Ellen's office. Ellen called me from her car while I was still in my kitchen. "He's escalating," she said. "He just told my associate that if you attempt to introduce any documents obtained from the deceased's private property without going through proper estate channels, he'll file an emergency motion to have the room sealed and all contents held in trust pending review. He's claiming the room may contain assets that are rightfully part of the Callaway Hart Partnership estate." The audacity of it was briefly breathtaking. Can he do that? He can file the motion. The question is whether a judge grants it, and I can make sure that doesn't happen quickly. But Meg, they know you've been in the room. You need to be prepared. That evening, Diana Hart came to my house. She didn't call ahead. She knocked, and when I opened the door, she stood on my porch in a gray wool blazer, her expression arranged into something that was trying to be concern. Connor was in the car at the curb, not even pretending to be invisible. "Meg," she said, "I think we need to talk about Thomas." "I think you need to leave my property," I said. Something shifted in her eyes. The warmth didn't drop so much as pause, like a server briefly going offline. "I understand you're upset," she said. "And I want you to know that nothing in that room should be interpreted without context." "Diana," I kept my voice even. "I have an attorney. Any communication you want to have goes through her. Good night." I closed the door. I stood in my hallway and listened to the sound of her heels on my porch stairs, the car door, the engine starting, the sound of them driving away. My hands were shaking again, but this time I recognized the feeling clearly. It wasn't fear. It was adrenaline, which is a different thing. It burns, but it burns forward. I called Ellen and gave her a full account. She filed a protective order application the next morning. After that, I allowed myself 3 days. I drove to my sister Joanna's house in Cincinnati, took long walks along the river, ate food I didn't cook myself, and let Joanna's rescue dog sleep at the foot of my bed. I said nothing specific about what was happening, only that I was dealing with something complicated, and I needed a few days of normalcy. The world hadn't ended. The documents were safe. Ellen knew what she was doing. I drove home on a Sunday afternoon, and I felt for the first time since Thomas died entirely clear. The offer came through Connor Hart's office on a Monday morning, 12 days after June 4th. Ellen forwarded it to me with a single line. Read this carefully before you react. The letter was dressed in legal language, but its meaning was straightforward. Diana Hart, acting in her capacity as surviving partner of Callaway Hart Properties, was prepared to offer me a settlement of $400,000 in exchange for my agreement not to pursue any claim against the firm, not to introduce the contents of the basement room as evidence in any legal proceeding, and to sign a non-disclosure agreement covering all aspects of my late husband's business affairs. The letter framed this as a gesture of generosity toward a grieving widow. It noted that litigation would be protracted, costly, and emotionally taxing. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the kitchen table, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the backyard, at the garden Thomas had maintained for years. The raised beds he'd built from cedar planks, the bird bath he'd installed the summer Claire was 12. I had, since his death, kept the garden going without fully deciding to. Some habits simply continue. $400,000 was not nothing. It was for a retired school teacher with a paid-off house a significant sum. They knew that the offer was calibrated, large enough to feel like relief, small enough to be a fraction of what they'd taken. It was designed to look like mercy while functioning as a buyout of my silence, and my claim on approximately $2.3 million. I called Ellen and told her to decline. "You sure?" she asked. Not to second-guess me, I understood. She needed my voice saying the word completely, I said. Ellen sent back a formal rejection the same afternoon. Within 2 hours, the tone from Connor's office shifted. He sent a follow-up letter again through Ellen, noting that the offer was time-limited and that should it expire, the Hart family would be compelled to vigorously defend all aspects of the partnership arrangement, including questioning the provenance and admissibility of the basement materials, threatening to challenge the evidence. Of course, what struck me in those days was how quiet I felt. I had expected fear, the escalating kind, the kind that wakes you at 3 in the morning with a pounding heart. Instead, I found myself moving through my days with a steadiness that surprised me. I made my coffee. I called the forensic accountant. I reviewed documents Ellen sent me. I walked 2 miles every morning through the neighborhood, past other people's ordinary houses, and I thought very clearly about what I was doing and why. They were watching. I knew that. The private investigator was presumably still around, noting who came to my house and when. I didn't try to hide anything. I lived normally, visibly, going about my days in a way that made clear I was not frightened. Into an inaction. The social support I found was not dramatic or cinematic. It wasn't a group of powerful friends rallying around me. It was quieter and more sustaining than that. Patricia came over on a Wednesday evening, and I told her carefully without legal specifics, but honestly what I was dealing with, that I had discovered Thomas had hidden assets, that there were people trying to prevent me from recovering them, that I was fighting it. She listened without filling the silence with reassurance, which was exactly what I needed. And then she said, "You were the most organized person in our school for 15 years. They picked the wrong woman to try to confuse." I laughed for the first time in weeks. Ellen told me about a support network for surviving spouses who discovered financial fraud. Not a formal legal service, but a private online group carefully moderated where women in similar situations shared information and resources. I joined under a pseudonym. I read other women's stories for several evenings in California, in Texas, in Georgia. Women who had discovered hidden accounts, secret families, real estate schemes. Some had prevailed. Some were still fighting. All of them had found the same thing I was finding. That the loneliness of being deceived by someone you loved was its own particular grief, distinct from the grief of losing them. And that naming it helped. I also called Claire. This was the conversation I had most dreaded, and I had been postponing it. Claire was 27 and lived in Portland. Pragmatic, clear-eyed, and closer to her father than she would ever have admitted. She deserved to know, and she deserved to hear it from me. I told her over the phone on a Sunday evening, methodically and without editorializing the hidden assets, Diana Hart, the room, what the documents showed. There was a very long silence when I finished. How long have you known? She asked. Since April, I said. Another silence. Then why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I needed to know what I was dealing with before I brought you into it. I heard her exhale. Okay, she said quietly. What do you need from me? Nothing yet, I said. I just needed you to know. She flew home the following weekend. She didn't say much about her father, not directly, but she sat with me at the kitchen table while I went through files, and when I looked up, she met my eyes with an expression I recognized. It was the face I'd seen on her since she was a child when she decided something. Resolved, unapologetic. Whatever Diana and Connor Hart thought they were dealing with, they had not accounted for the full picture. They came on a Saturday in early July and they came together. I saw Connor's car from the upstairs window before they knocked. A silver BMW parked carefully at the curb, not rushing. Calculated arrival time. Late morning when people are domestic and off guard. Claire had gone to get coffee and wouldn't be back for 20 minutes. The timing felt noted, which meant they had been watching. I went downstairs and opened the door before they could knock a second time. Diana was dressed casually, a departure from her usual professional armor, clearly intentional linen pants, a soft blue blouse. She was carrying a tin of cookies. Connor stood slightly behind her in chinos and a collared shirt, his expression set to reasonable older brother. They looked like neighbors stopping by. Meg, Diana said. Her voice was warm in that new calculated way. We wanted to come by personally without lawyers. She held up the cookie tin with a small apologetic smile. I know things have gotten complicated, and I feel terrible about that. I really do. I looked at the cookie tin. I looked at Connor. I stepped back slightly from the door. Not enough to invite them in. I've asked that all communication go through my attorney, I said. I know, Diana said, and I respect that. I do, but Meg, this is between us, not lawyers. Thomas would have hated all of this. You know that he would have wanted us to handle this as a family. There it was. Thomas would have wanted the invocation of my dead husband's wishes used as a lever. I had been a high school teacher for 22 years. I had seen 17-year-olds deploy more sophisticated manipulation. But Diana delivered it with enough genuine feeling that I could see how. In an earlier state, grief raw, confused, overwhelmed, it might have worked. Can we just come in for 10 minutes? Connor said. Not as adversaries, as people who all loved Thomas. Loved Thomas. I let the phrase settle. No, I said. Diana's expression shifted only slightly, but I was watching for it. The warmth dimmed 1 degree. Me, I want you to think carefully about what you're doing. The documents in that room, Thomas prepared them during a period when he was very ill, very frightened. He wasn't thinking clearly what he wrote about me, about Connor. It's not the full picture. Then you'll have an opportunity to present the full picture to the court, I said. Connor spoke then, and the pleasantness in his voice thinned. If this goes to litigation, Mag, it will be very public. Thomas's reputation, everything he built, becomes fair game. Do you want Claire reading about her father in the newspaper? Because that's what's coming if you keep pushing. There it was too. Claire. The threat dressed as concern. I felt something move through my chest. Not quite fear, but adjacent to it. They were right that it would be public. They were right that it would be painful. They were counting on that pain to make me hesitate. Connor, I said, threatening to destroy Thomas's reputation in court in order to protect assets that were fraudulently transferred is the kind of strategy that tends to look very bad in front of a judge. I'd encourage you to discuss that approach with your own attorney. A silence. Connor's jaw tightened. Diana looked at him briefly. A quick exchange. The kind between people who have rehearsed a conversation and just watched it go off script. You're making a mistake, Diana said, and the warmth was entirely gone now. The cool politeness I had known from years of company dinners was back, stripped of its pretense. We're trying to offer you a way through this that doesn't destroy everything. Everything that was hidden from me. I said, Meg, goodbye, Diana. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway with my back to it and my hands still on the doorknob, and I listened to their voices on the porch, low, quick, tight, with something that wasn't quite anger, but was heading there. Then the footsteps, the car doors, the engine, the fear arrived then properly in the quiet after they drove away. It sat in my stomach like cold water, and I let it. Connor's threat about Claire, about public exposure, about Thomas's reputation. Those weren't empty. He was a lawyer. He knew how to make things ugly and protracted and costly in ways that had nothing to do with winning. But then the fear did something I hadn't expected. It clarified because beneath the fear was something more solid. The image of a tin of cookies held out like a peace offering while delivering a threat. The careful casual clothes the Thomas would have wanted wielded like a crowbar. They were scared. People who held all the cards didn't come to your door on a Saturday morning with cookies. They were scared, and I was the reason. I went upstairs, sat at my desk, and wrote a detailed email to Ellen documenting the visit. What was said, the exact words, the timeline. I sent it with a timestamp of 11:43 in the morning. Then I picked up my phone and called Claire to tell her she should know what had just happened. She arrived back from the coffee shop 12 minutes later with 2 cups, set one in front of me, and said without preamble, "What did they say about me?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Cowards," she said with a precision that reminded me fiercely of myself at her age. I drank my coffee outside. My garden sat in the summer light, orderly and alive in mine. I had planted the lavender along the far bed 2 years ago, and it was only now beginning to establish itself properly. Some things took time. I was not going to stop. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in September, 10 weeks after Diana and Connor had stood on my porch. Ellen had requested and the court had granted an emergency evidentiary hearing on the fraudulent transfer claims, a proceeding that would determine whether the trust instrument transferring $2.3 million of Thomas's assets to Diana Hart was enforceable or voidable under Ohio law. It was not the final trial, but it was the moment where evidence would be formally presented and both sides examined under oath. Ellen called it the pivot point. She had been working toward it with the quiet intensity of someone who had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of case. I drove to the courthouse in Columbus on a gray September morning with Claire beside me. I wore a dark blazer and flat shoes and carried a folder I didn't need but wanted in my hands. I felt going through the security scanner an extraordinary stillness. The hearing room was smaller than I'd imagined from television, a standard wood-paneled courtroom, fluorescent lit with the muffled quality of a place designed to contain things. Connor Hart and Diana arrived with 2 additional attorneys from Connor's firm. A display of force that Ellen had anticipated and said would likely impress no one. Diana was back in her professional armor, tailored charcoal suit, hair controlled, but I noticed watching her take her seat that she was holding her pen very tightly. Ellen presented our case with an efficiency that I had come to recognize as her highest register of confidence. No theatrics, no building tension for its own sake, just the orderly introduction of facts that accumulated into something irrefutable. The Gail Peterson documents, David Park's forensic accounting report, which concluded that Thomas's partnership distributions had been artificially suppressed since 2018, resulting in approximately $1.1 million in underpayments to his estate. The audio recordings from Thomas's basement, which Ellen had had authenticated by a digital forensics expert before the hearing, in which Thomas and Diana discussed the trust arrangement in terms that made clear Meg's ignorance of it was not an oversight, but a deliberate condition of the plan. The recordings were the thing. Ellen played 2 of them through the courtroom's audio system. Not long, perhaps 4 minutes total, and in the silence that followed, I watched Diana Hart. She'd gone very still, the kind of stillness that isn't calm. Connor wrote something on a legal pad and passed it to her. She didn't look at it. Then it was Connor's turn. He challenged the admissibility of the recordings first, arguing they'd been obtained through a violation of privacy, a motion the judge had already reviewed and denied, citing Thomas's documented intent in the letter found with the recordings. He challenged the forensic accounting methodology. He challenged Gail Peterson's credibility, noting her NDA. The judge, a woman in her 60s with the expression of someone who had heard every variety of human dishonesty, and was not interested in hearing a new one, asked Connor directly why the trust instrument had not been disclosed during the probate process. Connor had an answer. It was a technical answer carefully constructed involving the classification of the trust as a pre-death inter vivos transfer rather than a testamentary bequest, and therefore outside the scope of standard probate disclosure. So your position, the judge said, is that your client lawfully received $2.3 million in assets from the dedent without the knowledge of his spouse, and that you, as the estate's retained counsel, had no obligation to disclose this to the surviving widow during probate. In the technical legal sense, Your Honor, I understand what you're saying in the technical legal sense, Mr. Part. I'm asking whether you believe it. A silence. And in that silence, that 5-second gap between the judge's question and Connor's answer, Diana Hart turned and looked at him. It was the first time I had seen something crack in her composure. Not anger, something more like fear, the real kind, the kind that doesn't have a strategy ready. Connor began his answer, and it came out slightly wrong. Too many qualifications. A sentence that started in one direction and corrected into another. The judge's expression didn't change, but she made a note. They called Diana to the stand. Ellen questioned her with the kind of precision that didn't allow time for comfortable improvisation. The recordings were played again. Ellen asked Diana to explain in her own words what she had meant when she told Thomas in the recorded conversation. Meg doesn't need to know the structure. She just needs to know she's taken care of. Diana said the comment had been taken out of context. Ellen asked what the context was. Diana said it referred to Thomas's estate planning for Meg's future financial security. Ellen pointed out that the trust in question named Diana Hart, not Margaret Calloway, as the sole beneficiary. There was a pause. Diana began to explain that there had been subsequent arrangements, planning that was ongoing, and Ellen quietly introduced an exhibit showing that no such subsequent arrangements had ever been filed, drawn up, or legally documented in any form. Connor objected. The judge noted the objection and overruled it. I sat at the plaintiff's table, and I watched Diana Hart on the witness stand look for a version of events that still worked, and come up empty. It was not a satisfying thing to watch. Exactly. It was more like watching a piece of architecture you had once admired reveal the flawed engineering at its core. Something that looked solid. Finally showing you what it was made of. I thought of the note in the workbench drawer. Open it on June 4, 2026. Thomas had known he was leaving me a loaded weapon. He had been too much of a coward to detonate it himself, to confess while he was alive, to look me in the face and say, I betrayed you, and here is the evidence. He had handed me the gun from the grave, and left me to do the hard part. That was a wound I hadn't finished with yet. But this courtroom this morning, this moment was not about Thomas. This was about what was mine. When the hearing concluded, the judge announced she would issue a written decision within 30 days, but indicated she was prepared to find substantial grounds for voiding the trust instrument on fraud grounds. She asked both parties to be available for a follow-up conference in October. In the hallway afterward, Ellen allowed herself a small, precise smile. That went well, she said. Yes, I said. Claire took my hand briefly and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The judge's written decision arrived on a Wednesday in late October, 31 days after the hearing. Ellen called me 20 minutes after it hit her inbox. I was in my kitchen. That table had become my command center throughout all of this. I had a cup of coffee that had gone cold in front of me, and I was looking at nothing in particular. She voided the trust, Ellen said entirely. I set down the coffee cup. The court found the trust instrument was executed under circumstances constituting constructive fraud against a marital interest under Ohio law. Ellen continued, the transfer is void. The assets revert to Thomas's estate, effectively to you as the primary heir and the probate concealment. I said the court has referred Connor Hart's conduct to the Ohio State Bar for a disciplinary investigation, citing a probable violation of his duties as a state counsel. We're also filing the civil fraud claims separately against both Diana and Connor individually, which will proceed on its own schedule. $23 million in assets returning to the estate. An attorney facing professional discipline. A civil fraud claim built on recordings Thomas himself had made, documents Gail Peterson had kept for years against the day someone came asking, and a forensic accounting report so thorough that the other side's own expert had failed to materially challenge it. I had not sought a dramatic ending. I had sought a true one. The civil claim settled 8 months later before trial. Their attorney, not Connor, who had been forced to withdraw due to his own involvement, and was by that point managing his bar investigation, contacted Ellen with a proposal. It was, Ellen told me, the offer of people who had done the math and understood they were going to lose. The final settlement figure in addition to the estate recovery was $680,000 representing suppressed partnership distributions, legal fees, and interest. I signed the agreement on a Tuesday morning at a neutral location. Diana Hart was not in the room. Her attorney signed on her behalf. Connor Hart was disbarred 8 months after that. Multiple violations, failure to disclose a conflict of interest, breach of fiduciary duty, conduct involving dishonesty, and misrepresentation. The decision was posted publicly on the bar's website. Ellen sent me the link without comment. I read it once and didn't read it again. Diana Hart attempted to maintain the real estate firm after the settlement, but without the voided assets and with the reputational damage of being publicly identified as the beneficiary of a fraudulent trust. The business contracted rapidly. She sold her Columbus condo and moved out of state within a year. I didn't track where she went. I had no interest in Diana Hart's future. I had spent enough of my life in proximity to her past. Ellen had been extraordinary. I told her so at our final meeting, plainly looking at her directly. She accepted it without deflection or excessive modesty. Cases like this should go the way this one went, she said. They don't always. I drove home through a November Columbus afternoon, thinking about the legal pad I'd started on the kitchen table 18 months earlier. The list of things that hadn't seemed right. The discipline of a woman who had spent 22 years teaching young people to look at evidence, ask hard questions, and follow them wherever they led. I had done that in the middle of grief, in the middle of betrayal, under threat from 2 people with more legal resources than me. It had come out this way. The safe in the basement sat empty. I had already decided to have the room dismantled. Thomas had built it. I was glad he had, and I wanted it gone. Some things serve their purpose completely and leave. My new life did not begin with a dramatic gesture. It began gradually and without announcement, the way most real things do. I sold the Columbus house in the spring. I gave myself the full winter to decide. And by February I knew. The house had been the site of a marriage I now understood differently. And I wanted a place that was mine in the way a beginning is yours, without the weight of all those years inside the walls. I bought a smaller house 3m away, good kitchen, south-facing garden, enough space for Claire when she visited. I turned the basement into a writing room because in the year of my legal case, I had started keeping a journal, and found I hadn't stopped. I took a part-time consulting position helping a nonprofit navigate estate fraud cases, useful work, which I have always found better than glamorous work. Patricia came to my housewarming with champagne and said, "You know what's remarkable? You don't seem angry." "I'm not," I said. And it was true. I had done my grieving for Thomas, for the marriage I'd thought I had. For the years he had quietly built a separate life. Grief reorganizes itself eventually from something that arrests you into something you carry. Claire and I were closer than before any of this. She showed up when it mattered. We talk twice a week now. In the spring, I began to date again carefully with the weariness of someone who had learned that character and presentation are not the same thing. A man named David who taught architecture and was transparent about his life in the small ways Thomas had not been. I am not in a hurry. I am not afraid. Diana Hart relocated to Phoenix where a smaller real estate venture failed within 2 years. Depleted capital, damaged reputation, no institutional partners willing to take the risk. Connor's disbarment ended his professional life entirely. Public record of his conduct toward a grieving widow left his reputation beyond recovery. Neither of them remained in Columbus. I do not think about them often. Gail Peterson had her NDA declared unenforceable and received formal recognition from the Ohio State Bar. I sent her flowers once. She sent back a note. I'm glad you knocked. So am I. The lavender I transplanted from the old house took hold in my new garden and bloomed the following summer. Dense, fragrant, the kind of established thing that only gets better with time. I was established.